Chicago, Illinois, November 17th, 1928. The most powerful gangster in America sat waiting in a private dining room at the Lexington Hotel, preparing for a meeting that violated every rule of the criminal underworld. Al Capone, whose bootlegging empire generated over $100 million annually, was about to negotiate with a 23-year-old black gangster from Harlem named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. What transpired over the next 3 hours would remain buried for decades, a secret so dangerous that both men protected it until their deaths. The deal they struck that morning would make Bumpy Johnson untouchable, reshape American organized crime forever, and prove that the most dangerous negotiations are the ones history never records. The telegram arrived at Stephanie St. Clair's Harlem headquarters on the evening of November 12, 1928, and its content were so unexpected that the legendary Madam Queen read it 3 times before accepting that the words on the page were genuine. The message was brief, written in the careful language of men who understood that communications could be intercepted and used as evidence. It contained an invitation, a guarantee of safe passage, and a time frame. Al Capone wanted to meet with a representative from Harlem's black gambling operations. The representative would be allowed to travel to Chicago, would be granted an audience, and would be permitted to leave alive regardless of the outcome of whatever discussions took place. Stephanie St. Clair had been running Harlem's most successful policy banking operation for nearly a decade by 1928. She had built her empire through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an understanding of her community that no outsider could replicate. Her numbers game employed hundreds of runners, generated millions in annual revenue, and provided one of the few paths to economic advancement available to black residents in an era when legitimate opportunities were systematically denied to them. But St. Clair's empire was under siege, and she knew that without intervention, everything she had built would be destroyed within months. Dutch Schultz and other white gangsters had been waging war against Harlem's black operators for over a year. They wanted control of the policy banks, wanted the millions in profits that flowed through Harlem's numbers game, and they were willing to kill as many people as necessary to take what they wanted. St. Clair had fought back with everything she had, but the mathematics of the situation were inescapable. White gangsters had more money, more guns, more political connections, and more willingness to escalate violence to levels that would destroy the very operations they were fighting over. The invitation from Capone represented something unprecedented. The most powerful white gangster in America was offering to negotiate rather than simply taking what he wanted. This suggested that Capone saw something in Harlem's operations that made conquest less attractive than cooperation, that he recognized value in black gangsters that other white criminals dismissed or ignored. But the invitation also represented extraordinary danger. Sending a representative to Chicago meant putting someone's life entirely in Capone's hands, trusting that his guarantee of safe passage was genuine, betting everything on the hope that the meeting would produce results worth the risk. St. Clair spent 2 days considering her options before deciding to accept the invitation. The alternative was continued warfare that would eventually destroy her organization regardless of how hard she fought. Negotiation offered at least the possibility of survival, of autonomy, of an arrangement that would allow black gangsters to continue operating in their own territories without constant interference from white criminals who viewed them as inferior beings whose businesses existed only to be taken. The question of who to send required equally careful consideration. The representative needed to be intelligent enough to negotiate effectively with Capone and his advisors, needed to be brave enough to walk into the most dangerous gangsters' headquarters without showing fear, needed to understand both the details of Harlem's operations and the broader dynamics of organized crime well enough to propose arrangements that would appeal to Capone's business instincts, needed to be expendable enough that his loss, if Capone's safe passage guarantee proved false, would not cripple the organization. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson met all these criteria. At 23 years old, Johnson had already established himself as one of St. Clair's most capable lieutenants. He was intelligent, educated beyond what his circumstances might have suggested, and possessed a calm demeanor that never cracked regardless of pressure. He understood numbers operations thoroughly, having worked his way up through the organization from runner to collector to manager. He was respected by other black gangsters throughout Harlem, which would give any agreement he negotiated legitimacy with operators who might otherwise resist cooperation with white criminals. Johnson was also relatively unknown outside Harlem, which meant that his death, if Capone betrayed the safe passage guarantee, would not attract the attention that killing a more prominent figure might generate. This calculation was cold, but necessary. St. Clair was sending Johnson into a situation where his survival depended entirely on whether Al Capone was a man of his word, and she needed to balance the potential gains against the potential losses with clear-eyed pragmatism. When St. Clair summoned Johnson to explain the mission, she did not minimize the dangers. She described the situation with brutal honesty, explaining that Capone's invitation might be genuine or might be a trap designed to eliminate Harlem's most capable young gangster. She explained that Johnson would be traveling alone into territory controlled entirely by white gangsters who might kill him simply for being black in the wrong place at the wrong time. She explained that even if the meetings went well, there was no guarantee that any agreement would actually be honored once Johnson returned to Harlem. Johnson listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of whatever fears or calculations were running through his mind. When St. Clair finished, Johnson asked only one question. He wanted to know what authority he would have to negotiate, whether he could accept terms on Harlem's behalf, or whether he would need to bring any proposed arrangement back for St. Clair's approval. The question demonstrated the quality of thinking that had made Johnson valuable in the first place. He was already planning how to conduct the negotiation, already considering what flexibility he would need to respond to whatever Capone proposed. St. Clair granted Johnson broad authority to negotiate but not to make final commitments. He could discuss terms, could indicate what Harlem might accept, could respond to proposals from Capone's side, but any actual agreement would need her approval before becoming binding. This arrangement protected both parties. Johnson could negotiate effectively without being limited by predetermined positions, but St. Clair retained ultimate control over whether Harlem would accept whatever terms emerged from the discussions. Johnson departed Harlem on November 14, 1928, carrying documents that detailed Harlem's policy operations, financial analyses showing the costs and revenues of the ongoing warfare with white gangsters, and proposal for territorial arrangements that might satisfy both sides. He traveled by train, arriving in Chicago on November 15th, and was met at Union Station by two of Capone's men who searched him thoroughly before escorting him to a safe house, where he would wait until the meeting was arranged. The 2 days Johnson spent in Chicago before the meeting were designed to demonstrate Capone's power and to test Johnson's nerve. He was housed comfortably, but was under constant surveillance. He was fed well, but was never alone. He was treated respectfully, but was reminded constantly that he was entirely at the mercy of an organization that could kill him at any moment without consequence. If Johnson was intimidated by this treatment, he never showed it. He ate the food that was provided, slept in the bed that was offered, and waited with the patience of a man who understood that showing fear would be interpreted as weakness, and that weakness would undermine any negotiation before it began. The morning of November 17, 1928, arrived with the kind of bitter cold that Chicago inflicted on its residents as winter approached. Bumpy Johnson rose early, dressed in the best suit he had brought from Harlem, and prepared himself mentally for the meeting that would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the fate of black organized crime across America. He understood that what happened in the next few hours would establish precedents that would govern relationships between white and black gangsters for decades, would determine whether black criminals could maintain autonomous operations or would be forced into permanent subordination to white criminal organizations. The Lexington Hotel on South Michigan Avenue was Alabama Capone's fortress, a building where every employee answered to him, where every room could become a trap or an escape route depending on circumstances, where the most powerful gangster in America conducted business that shaped the criminal landscape of an entire nation. Johnson arrived at the hotel at precisely 9:47 in the morning, escorted by the same two men who had met him at Union Station 2 days earlier. They entered through a side entrance, avoiding the lobby where too many witnesses might observe a black man being treated as a guest rather than as a servant. The search Johnson endured before being allowed into Capone's presence was thorough to the point of humiliation. He was patted down, his clothing was examined, his shoes were inspected, his mouth was checked for concealed weapons. The men conducting the search were professional, but not gentle, making clear through their handling that Johnson's life depended entirely on Capone's continued goodwill. Johnson submitted to the search without complaint, understanding that objecting would accomplish nothing except demonstrating that he could be provoked, which would weaken his position in the negotiation to come. The elevator ride to the fourth floor felt longer than it should have, the mechanical hum of the machinery providing the only sound as Johnson and his escorts ascended through the building. Johnson used the time to steady his breathing, to calm his heartbeat, to prepare his mind for the confrontation ahead. He was about to sit across a table from a man who had ordered the deaths of dozens of rivals, who controlled an empire worth more than many legitimate corporations, who could have Johnson killed with a word and would face no consequences for doing so. Showing fear was not an option. Showing weakness was not an option. Johnson needed to present himself as a representative worthy of negotiating with, as someone whose organization deserved respect rather than contempt. The private dining room where Capone waited was furnished with the kind of expensive taste that announced wealth without being ostentatious. Mahogany tables and chairs, crystal chandeliers, artwork on the walls that suggested culture and refinement. Food had been laid out on a long table, Italian dishes that filled the room with rich aromas, expensive wines that cost more than most Americans earned in a month. The display was designed to impress, to remind visitors that they were dealing with a man whose resources dwarfed anything they could imagine, whose power extended into realms that ordinary criminals could not access. Al Capone sat at the head of the main table, wearing one of the custom suits that had become his trademark, suits that cost more than many families' annual income, suits that announced his status as someone who had transcended the limitations of his immigrant origins to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America. Capone was 29 years old in November 1928, had been running Chicago's criminal operations for over 3 years, had survived assassination attempts, gang wars, and federal investigations that would have destroyed lesser men. His face bore the scars of violence, but his eyes showed the intelligence that had allowed him to build and maintain an empire. 2 other men flanked Capone at the table. Jake Guzik, known as Greasy Thumb, was Capone's financial manager, the man who handled the organization's money, who managed relationships with corrupt politicians and police officers, who understood the business side of criminal enterprises better than anyone else in Chicago. Frank Nitti was Capone's enforcer, the man who handled problems that required violence, who had earned his reputation through a willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect Capone's interests. The presence of both Guzik and Nitti at the meeting sent a clear message. Capone was taking this negotiation seriously enough to involve his 2 most important advisors, seriously enough to have both his financial expert and his violence expert present to evaluate whatever Johnson proposed. This was not a courtesy meeting where Capone would listen politely before dismissing Harlem's concerns. This was a genuine business discussion where real decisions might be made. What happened next shocked Johnson, despite his preparation for the unexpected. Capone stood as Johnson entered the room, walked around the table, and extended his hand for a handshake. In 1928 America, white men did not shake hands with black men. Social customs that governed interactions between races were absolute, were enforced through violence and social ostracism, were violated only by those willing to face severe consequences. Capone shaking Johnson's hand was a statement, a declaration that within this room, the normal rules of American society did not apply, that Johnson would be treated as a business equal rather than as a racial inferior. Johnson accepted the handshake with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout his time in Chicago. He met Capone's eyes directly, neither challenging nor deferring, simply acknowledging the gesture and the respect it implied. The handshake lasted only a moment, but it established the tone for everything that would follow. This would be a negotiation between businessmen, not a confrontation between a powerful white gangster and a subordinate black criminal begging for mercy. Capone gestured for Johnson to sit, offered food and wine, and allowed several minutes to pass in casual conversation before turning to business. This, too, was calculated, designed to put Johnson at ease while also evaluating him. Capone asked about the train journey from New York, about Johnson's impressions of Chicago, about matters that had nothing to do with the purpose of the meeting. He was testing Johnson's ability to engage in social discourse, to handle himself in situations that required more than just criminal competence, to demonstrate the kind of sophistication that would be necessary if any ongoing relationship were to be established. Johnson handled the social portion of the meeting with skill that impressed everyone present. He spoke well, answered questions thoughtfully, demonstrated knowledge that extended beyond the narrow confines of Harlem's policy operations. He discussed current events, showed familiarity with business concepts that most street-level criminals would not understand, presented himself as someone who could serve as a genuine liaison between organizations rather than just a messenger carrying proposals back and forth. By the time Capone signaled that the casual portion of the meeting was concluded and that serious business discussion should begin, Johnson had already accomplished something significant. He had established himself as worthy of serious consideration, had demonstrated that Harlem's black gangsters were not the ignorant street criminals that many white gangsters assumed them to be. The transition from social pleasantries to business negotiation happened smoothly, Capone leaning back in his chair and fixing Johnson with a gaze that had intimidated men far more powerful than a young Harlem numbers operator. The warmth that had characterized the previous conversation drained from Capone's expression, replaced by the cold calculation of a businessman evaluating a potential deal. Johnson recognized the shift immediately and adjusted his own demeanor accordingly, straightening slightly in his chair, meeting Capone's gaze with equal directness, preparing to present the proposition that Stephanie St. Clair had sent him to deliver. Capone began by acknowledging what both men already knew. The situation in Harlem was untenable for everyone involved. Dutch Schultz and other white gangsters were spending enormous resources trying to take over black gambling operations. Were making some progress, but at costs that exceeded any reasonable return on investment. Were attracting law enforcement attention that threatened operations far beyond Harlem's borders. Black gangsters were losing the war slowly, but inevitably. Were watching their people get killed and their operations disrupted, were facing eventual destruction regardless of how hard they fought. The current trajectory benefited no one except the federal agents who were using the violence as justification for expanded investigations into organized crime activities. Johnson confirmed this assessment and provided details that demonstrated his thorough understanding of the situation. He described the financial costs of the ongoing warfare, the monthly expenses for security, for bribes, for replacing personnel who had been killed or arrested, for maintaining operations despite constant interference. He described the human costs, the funerals that had become routine, the families left without providers, the communities traumatized by violence that showed no signs of ending. He described the operational costs, the inefficiencies created by constant disruption, the opportunities lost because resources were devoted to survival rather than expansion, the degradation of the very businesses that made the territory worth fighting over. The proposition Johnson presented was straightforward in its basic structure, but revolutionary in its implications. Harlem's black gambling operations would pay tribute to Capone's organization, a percentage of gross profits in exchange for protection and autonomy. Capone would use his influence to prevent other white gangsters from attacking black territories, would ensure that the warfare currently destroying both sides' profitability would cease, would guarantee that black operators could conduct their business without interference from white criminals. In exchange, black gangsters would accept Capone's authority over territorial boundaries, would pay the agreed tribute reliably and on time, would not attempt to expand into territories controlled by white gangsters. Guzik examined the financial documents Johnson had brought, the detailed analyses of Harlem's policy operations, the projections of revenue and profit under various scenarios. His expression remained neutral as he reviewed the numbers. but Johnson noticed that Guzik nodded slightly at several points, apparently confirming that the figures presented were reasonable and that the proposed arrangement would generate significant income for Capone's organization with minimal effort or risk. The discussion that followed covered every aspect of the proposed arrangement. Percentage rates were debated, with Johnson arguing for lower tribute and Capone's side pushing for higher payments. Territory definitions were discussed, with careful attention to exactly which neighborhoods would be considered black territory and which would remain under white control. Enforcement mechanisms were examined, with both sides considering how violations of the agreement would be handled, who would have authority to punish violations, how disputes would be resolved before they escalated to violence. Throughout the negotiation, Johnson demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what Capone had expected from a young black gangster. He understood financial concepts that many legitimate businessmen would struggle with. He anticipated objections before they were raised and had responses prepared. He knew when to push back against unfavorable terms and when to concede points that were less important than they appeared. He conducted himself like a professional negotiator rather than like a desperate criminal begging for mercy, and this professionalism earned him increasing respect from everyone present. The negotiation reached its critical moment when Capone raised the fundamental objection that Johnson had been expecting since the meeting began. The social implications of the proposed arrangement were staggering. White gangsters making formal deals with black criminals violated every norm of segregated American society, violated the assumptions that governed relationships between races, violated the hierarchies that both legitimate and criminal America depended upon to maintain order. If other Italian bosses learned that Capone was negotiating with black gangsters as equals, treating them as partners rather than as inferiors to be exploited or destroyed, the consequences could include challenges to Capone's leadership, refusal to honor agreements he had made, accusations of weakness that would invite attacks from rivals who smelled vulnerability. Johnson addressed this objection directly, acknowledging the social complications while arguing that business considerations should override social customs when the business case was compelling. He pointed out that Capone had already demonstrated willingness to work with people outside Italian criminal traditions, had built relationships with Jewish gangsters, had cooperated with Irish criminals, had shown pragmatism about ethnicity when cooperation was profitable. The proposed arrangement with black gangsters was simply an extension of this pragmatism, an acknowledgement that rigid adherence to racial hierarchies was costing everyone money that cooperation could generate instead. The argument was persuasive because it appealed to Capone's most fundamental motivation. Al Capone was a businessman first, a gangster second. His greatest innovations had been organizational rather than violent, had involved creating structures that generated profit more efficiently than competitors could match, had demonstrated that cooperation between criminal groups could be more profitable than constant warfare. The proposition from Harlem fit this pattern perfectly, offering steady income with minimal effort, offering stability in territories that were currently producing nothing but expenses, offering a model that could potentially be extended to black communities across the country. Capone was silent for a long moment after Johnson finished presenting his arguments. The room remained still, everyone waiting to see whether the most powerful gangster in America would accept the unprecedented proposal or would reject it and continue the warfare that was destroying profitability on all sides. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, until even Johnson's carefully maintained composure began showing signs of strain. When Al Capone finally spoke, his words transformed the negotiation from an unexpected success into something that Bumpy Johnson could never have anticipated. Capone did not simply accept the proposal that Harlem had sent Johnson to present. Instead, he revealed that he had been developing his own plans for reorganizing relationships between white and black criminals, plans that aligned remarkably with what Johnson was proposing, plans that went far beyond the immediate question of Harlem survival to envision a restructuring of American organized crime that would acknowledge racial realities while creating mechanisms for profitable cooperation. Capone explained his thinking with a clarity that demonstrated why he had become the most successful gangster in America. Prohibition would not last forever. The political support for the 18th Amendment was already eroding, and within a decade, perhaps less, the sale of alcohol would be legal again. When that happened, bootlegging would cease to be the primary source of income for organized crime, and every criminal organization in the country would need alternative revenue sources to replace what they were losing. Gambling was the obvious successor to bootlegging as the most profitable illegal enterprise. And here was where black gangsters had something that white gangsters needed. Harlem's numbers operations were the most sophisticated gambling enterprise in America. The systems that Stephanie St. Clair and other black operators had developed, the betting procedures, the collection methods, the calculation systems, the payout structures, were more advanced than anything Italian gangsters were running. Black operators had figured out how to make policy gambling efficient and profitable in ways that white gangsters had not yet mastered. This meant that black gangsters had valuable knowledge that could improve gambling operations everywhere. Knowledge that would become increasingly important as gambling replaced bootlegging as the foundation of organized crime. The counterproposal Capone outlined was astonishing in its scope. He would accept Harlem's tribute arrangement, but at a reduced rate of 15% rather than the 20% Johnson had proposed. The reduction was not generosity, but investment. In exchange for lower tribute, Capone wanted something that had not been part of Harlem's original proposition. He wanted knowledge transfer, wanted St. Clair to send her best numbers operators to Chicago to teach Capone's people the systems that made Harlem's operations so successful. He wanted to learn from black gangsters rather than simply extracting money from them. Wanted to build a relationship that would provide ongoing benefits beyond the immediate tribute payments. But Capone's proposal extended even further. He wanted Johnson himself to remain in Chicago as a permanent liaison between his organization and black gangsters across the country. Johnson would learn how Italian criminal organizations operated, would understand the structures and relationships that governed Capone's empire, would become the bridge between two worlds that had previously operated in complete separation. This liaison role would make Johnson essential to maintaining whatever arrangements were established, would give him access to both black and white criminal networks, would position him to coordinate cooperation between organizations that could not openly acknowledge their relationship. The implications of this counterproposal were staggering. Capone was not simply agreeing to leave Harlem alone in exchange for tribute. He was proposing to integrate black gangsters into a national criminal structure, to create formal though secret relationships between white and black criminal organizations, to build something that had never existed before in American organized crime. He was acknowledging that black gangsters had value beyond the money that could be extracted from their territories, acknowledging that they possessed expertise worth learning from, acknowledging that cooperation could benefit both sides in ways that mere tribute arrangements could not capture. Johnson understood immediately that he was being offered something extraordinary, something that exceeded his authority to accept on Harlem's behalf. St. Clair had given him permission to negotiate terms for a protection arrangement, but this counterproposal involved commitments far beyond anything she had anticipated. Sending operators to Chicago to train Capone's people was a significant resource commitment. Leaving Johnson himself in Chicago as a permanent liaison would deprive Harlem of one of its most capable young gangsters. These decisions required St. Clair's explicit approval, could not be made by Johnson alone regardless of how attractive the counterproposal appeared. Capone anticipated this response and provided a telephone in the dining room for Johnson to call Harlem. The call was arranged through Capone's switchboard, was certainly monitored by Capone's people, but this surveillance was expected and did not prevent Johnson from communicating the essential elements of the counterproposal to St. Clair. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Johnson explaining what Capone had proposed and St. Clair asking questions that probed every aspect of the arrangement. St. Clair's decision, when it came, demonstrated the same strategic intelligence that had built her empire in the first place. She recognized that Capone's counterproposal, while demanding more from Harlem than originally anticipated, offered benefits that far exceeded the original proposition. Formal integration into a national criminal structure would provide protection that mere tribute could not guarantee. Knowledge sharing would create ongoing relationships that both sides would have incentives to maintain. Johnson's role as liaison would give Harlem a voice in decisions that affected black gangsters across the country, would position black operators to influence the development of organized crime rather than simply reacting to decisions made by white gangsters. St. Clair authorized Johnson to accept the counterproposal with one modification. She wanted explicit confirmation that the arrangement would extend beyond Harlem, that black operators in other cities would have the opportunity to join the same structure under the same terms, that this was the beginning of a national arrangement rather than simply a deal between Capone and Harlem. This modification served St. Clair's interests by expanding the arrangement scope, but it also served Capone's interests by creating a broader base of tribute payments and a more comprehensive organizational structure. Capone agreed to the modification without hesitation. He had already been considering how to extend the arrangement beyond Harlem, had already been in preliminary discussions with black gangsters in Detroit, St. Louis, and Baltimore. The modification simply formalized what Capone had already been planning, accelerating the creation of a national structure that would incorporate black gambling operations across major American cities. The weeks following the Chicago meeting transformed Bumpy Johnson's life in ways he could not have imagined when he boarded the train from New York. He remained in Chicago as agreed, living in a comfortable apartment provided by Capone's organization, meeting regularly with Capone and his advisors to work out the detailed implementation of the arrangement they had negotiated. He learned the inner workings of Italian criminal organizations, understood how Capone's empire functioned, absorbed knowledge about corruption networks, political relationships, and organizational structures that would prove invaluable throughout his career. The knowledge transfer that Capone had requested began within weeks of the agreement. 3 of Stephanie St. Clair's best numbers operators traveled to Chicago, bringing documentation of Harlem systems and spending 3 months teaching Capone's people how to run policy gambling more efficiently. The training covered everything from betting slip design to collection route optimization to calculation methods that minimized errors and maximized throughput. Capone's gambling operations improved significantly as a result, generating additional revenue that more than offset the reduced tribute rate that had been negotiated. The tribute system was implemented smoothly, with quarterly payments flowing from Harlem to Capone's organization beginning in early 1929. The first payment of approximately $750,000 established the arrangement as real, as something that would actually function rather than being merely theoretical agreement. The money was delivered in cash through intermediaries, was deposited in banks that Capone controlled, was laundered through legitimate businesses until it became indistinguishable from legal income. The logistics of the tribute system demonstrated that both sides were serious about making the arrangement work. More importantly, the violence in Harlem decreased dramatically. Dutch Schultz and other white gangsters who had been fighting for control of black territories received word through channels that the situation had changed, that Harlem and other black neighborhoods were now under Capone's protection, that continued attacks would be viewed as violations of arrangements that Capone had made. The message was delivered with sufficient weight that Schultz, despite his ambitions, recognized that fighting Capone-protected territories would cost more than any potential gains. The warfare that had been destroying both sides' profitability came to an end, replaced by an uneasy peace that allowed everyone to focus on making money rather than killing each other. Johnson's role as liaison expanded as word of the Harlem arrangement spread through black criminal networks across the country. Operators in Detroit reached out, wanting to negotiate similar protection for their territories. Baltimore's black gangsters sent representatives to discuss joining the structure. St. Louis, Philadelphia, Cleveland, each city with significant black gambling operations sent inquiries, seeking the same autonomy and protection that Harlem had secured. Johnson coordinated these negotiations, traveling between cities, explaining the arrangement, helping black operators understand what would be required and what benefits they would receive. By mid-1929, the structure that Capone and Johnson had created encompassed black gambling operations in a dozen major cities, generated millions in annual tribute for Capone's organization, and provided unprecedented stability for black criminal enterprises that had previously operated without protection or recognition. The arrangement remained secret, known only to top leadership on both sides, concealed behind public appearances that maintained the fiction of complete separation between white and black criminal organizations. But within the underworld, the arrangement was understood and respected, creating order where chaos had previously reigned. The relationship between Capone and Johnson developed into something approaching genuine respect over the months Johnson spent in Chicago. Capone recognized Johnson's intelligence and capability, valued his counsel on matters involving black communities, sought his perspective when decisions might affect the arrangement they had built together. Johnson learned from Capone's example, absorbed lessons about organization and leadership that would serve him throughout his career, developed understanding of how to build and maintain power that transcended the immediate circumstances of any particular situation. The arrangement also created unexpected benefits for black communities beyond the immediate participants in criminal enterprises. Black gangsters who achieved stability through the Capone arrangement invested some of their profits in legitimate businesses, provided loans to black entrepreneurs who could not access capital from white-controlled banks, supported community institutions that depended on private funding because public resources were denied to black neighborhoods. The economic development that resulted from stable criminal operations was not what anyone had intended when the arrangement was negotiated, but it became one of its most significant consequences. The commission that would eventually formalize cooperation among Italian-American crime families was not established until 1931, but the Capone-Johnson arrangement anticipated many of the commission's principles. Territorial exclusivity, tribute arrangements, dispute resolution mechanisms, all of these elements that would later characterize commission operations were first developed in the context of managing relationships between white and black criminals. When Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky created the commission, they incorporated lessons learned from the Capone-Johnson arrangement, adapting for Italian-American families what had first been developed for cross-racial criminal cooperation. Al Capone's conviction for tax evasion in October 1931 and his subsequent imprisonment might have destroyed the arrangement he had built with Bumpy Johnson, but instead the structure proved durable enough to survive the loss of its primary architect. Frank Nitti assumed leadership of the Chicago outfit and maintained the agreements Capone had established, recognizing that the tribute payments from black gambling operations provided valuable revenue that would be foolish to abandon. The commission, when it was established, incorporated the territorial arrangements with black gangsters into its national structure, assigning responsibility for collecting tribute and providing protection to appropriate families in each city. Johnson returned to Harlem in the early 1930s, his years in Chicago having transformed him from a promising young lieutenant into one of the most knowledgeable and connected black gangsters in America. He understood how Italian criminal organizations operated in ways that no other black gangster could match. He had relationships with white criminal leadership that provided protection and opportunities unavailable to anyone else. He had proven his capability and his reliability through years of successfully managing the liaison role, had demonstrated that he could be trusted to maintain arrangements that both sides depended upon. The protection that Johnson enjoyed as a result of the Capone arrangement made him effectively invincible within Harlem's criminal landscape. Other black gangsters who might have challenged his authority understood that moving against Johnson meant moving against the arrangement itself, meant risking retaliation not just from Johnson's organization, but from the Italian families who depended on the tribute system and the stability it provided. White gangsters who might have targeted Johnson understood that he was protected by agreements that extended to the highest levels of organized crime, that killing him would trigger responses far exceeding anything a single death would normally provoke. This invincibility allowed Johnson to build and maintain power in Harlem for over 3 decades, ruling the neighborhood's criminal underworld from the 1930s until his death in 1968. He survived challenges that would have destroyed less protected operators, navigated changes in the criminal landscape that eliminated many of his contemporaries, maintained his position through wars and investigations and generational shifts that transformed everything around him. The foundation of his power was always the arrangement he had negotiated with Al Capone in November 1928 the secret deal that had made him essential to the functioning of relationships between white and black organized crime. The consequences of the Capone-Johnson arrangement extended far beyond the immediate participants. The stability it created allowed black gambling operations to flourish, generating wealth that stayed in black communities rather than being extracted by white criminals. The organizational model established influenced how criminal enterprises were structured for decades, demonstrating that cooperation across racial lines could be profitable even in an era of rigid segregation. The precedent it set, that black gangsters could negotiate with white gangsters as business partners rather than simply as victims to be exploited, changed expectations about what was possible within the criminal underworld. The arrangement also demonstrated something profound about the relationship between profit motive and racial prejudice. Al Capone was not a racial progressive. There is no evidence that he held enlightened views about race relations or that he was motivated by anything other than business considerations when he agreed to negotiate with Harlem's black gangsters. But his willingness to set aside racial prejudice when cooperation was profitable showed that economic interests could override social conventions, that the rigid segregation of American society was not inevitable, but was rather a choice that could be made differently when incentives aligned. This insight had implications beyond the criminal context. If gangsters could cooperate across racial lines when it served their interests, perhaps legitimate businessmen and institutions could as well. The Capone-Johnson arrangement was not a civil rights achievement, was not motivated by idealism or a commitment to equality, was purely a business deal between criminals. But it demonstrated that the supposedly absolute barriers between races were actually negotiable, were maintained by choice rather than by necessity, could be crossed when the benefits of crossing them exceeded the costs of maintaining them. The secret that Capone and Johnson protected remained hidden for decades, known only to those directly involved in maintaining the arrangement. Historians who studied organized crime focused on Italian-American families, largely ignored black criminal enterprises, missed the connections between white and black underworlds that had shaped both for generations. Only as researchers began examining black organized crime more carefully, interviewing surviving participants, analyzing financial records and organizational structures, did the extent of the Capone-Johnson arrangement become clear. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, collapsing at a restaurant in Harlem while having dinner with friends. He was 62 years old and had ruled Harlem's underworld for over 3 decades, longer than almost any other gangster in American history. His power, his longevity, his legendary status within the black community all traced back to a meeting in a Chicago hotel room 40 years earlier, when a 23-year-old emissary from Harlem had convinced the most powerful gangster in America that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. The arrangement that emerged from that meeting had made Johnson invincible, had protected black gangsters across the country, had created stability that benefited communities far beyond the immediate participants in criminal enterprises. It had remained secret because revealing it would have damaged both sides, would have outraged white society that demanded segregation and black communities that resented any suggestion that black gangsters were subordinate to white criminals. But the secret, once revealed, demonstrated that the history of American organized crime was more complex than the simple narratives that had been told, that cooperation across racial lines had existed even in the most segregated era of American history, that the barriers between races had always been more permeable than they appeared. The most dangerous deal that Bumpy Johnson ever made was also the deal that made everything else possible. Walking into Al Capone's headquarters in November 1928, he risked death to negotiate an arrangement that would transform American organized crime. What he achieved was not just survival for Harlem's gambling operations, not just protection for himself and his associates, but a restructuring of criminal relationships that would persist for generations. The deal with Capone made Bumpy Johnson invincible, and that invincibility allowed him to shape history in ways that are only now being fully understood.